Welcome to Social Studies with Miss Pritchard. This video is for Global 2 students. It covers the nationalist revolutions in Latin America and Europe during the early 19th century. We need to start with the impact of the Enlightenment. It was the Enlightenment that introduced the ideas of democracy and equality, and once those ideas are out, you can't take them back. The Congress of Vienna tried very, very hard to turn back the clock and pretend that the Enlightenment had not occurred. However, the people were only willing to tolerate that for so long. The attempts to return to absolute monarchy and establish a balance of power only last for about 50 years. All right, the revolutions begin in Latin America, where they have slavery and a very rigid social structure in the Spanish colonies, and this leads to revolts. The citizens who were born in Spain, known as peninsulares, had all of the power. The Creoles, who are just as wealthy and have the same education but are born in Latin America, did not share any of the power. You also have slave revolts. The slaves and Indians are at the bottom of the social structure. And the first revolt is led by Toussaint Louverture. He is a slave in the French colony of Haiti. And he does successfully revolt. However, he dies during the revolution. But the revolution terrifies other colonies and nations because the slaves outnumber the settlers. So if they all joined together, they would definitely win. Simón Bolívar, he is a wealthy Creole from Venezuela, and he helps Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Panama, and Peru gain independence. His goal was to create a single nation in South America. He wanted it to be the United States of South America. However, the geography, meaning the mountains, the rainforest, the swift rivers, and high waterfalls, make a unified nation impossible. And that is because travel in that time period with that geography was very, very difficult, which made communication very poor. And if you don't have a strong communication network, you cannot have a unified nation state. José de San Martín, he helps Argentina and Chile gain independence, and he does join forces with Bolivar to end colonialism in South America. In Mexico, the revolution is led by Catholic priests. They work with the peasants and the lower classes to revolt. The two main leaders are Father Hidalgo and Father Morelos. And once all of the social classes join in the rebellion, Mexico gains its independence from Spain. Brazil is made an independent nation by a bloodless revolution. The King of Portugal had fled to Brazil to escape Napoleon. Once Napoleon is defeated, the king returns to Portugal. His son, Prince Dom Pedro, however, stays after, and he and the people of Brazil declare themselves an independent nation. In the 19th century, there are three main political philosophies. You have the conservative view, which is landowners and nobles. They like their traditional systems because they had power in those systems. Then you have the liberal viewpoint. Those tended to be merchants and business owners. They're still relatively wealthy. And they want limited democracy, meaning they want to have a voice in the government along with the landowners and nobles. And then you have the third viewpoint, which are the radicals, and they want liberty, equality, and democracy for all, regardless of your social or economic status. European nationalism. In 1815, there are three nation-states in Europe: France, Britain, and Spain, and the rest of Europe is controlled by empires. Within those empires, each culture wants their own nation-state. Liberals and radicals supported the nationalism, and this weakens the empires that are Russia, Austria, and the Ottomans. You can see a graphic on page 688 for the positives and negatives of European nationalism and the empires. Early rebellions. One of the first revolts is Greece against the Turks, who are the Ottoman Empire. European nations support the idea of Greek independence because they do not like Christian Europeans being controlled by Muslim Turks. There is a little bit of racism at play there, and you can add to that the fact that the Muslim Turks are darker and speak a different language, so that all adds into that whole racist notion that the Greeks should be independent. However, when you have the Belgians, Italians, and the Polish rebelling in the 1830s, that they did not support. And those rebellions are crushed, but it's a lot like putting a lid on a boiling pot, which if you've ever cooked, you know just creates a huge mess in the kitchen when it finally explodes. And that explosion happens in 1848. There are rebellions throughout Europe, including France, that give liberals the power. Now, the liberal governments tend to fall apart by 1850 because they cannot stay organized. And this is where we get into one of our three main themes for global studies, and that is organization is the key to power. And you also need to remember that lasting change takes time. It's not something that happens quickly. The problems in France. You have a radical mob that overthrows the government. This is the third government since the end of the revolution because you had Napoleon, then they attempted to return to a monarchy, and now we're getting a democracy. So France is like an out-of-control pendulum swinging just from one extreme to another. And what do you know? You have another Napoleon stepping in to lead France. This is Louis Napoleon. It's Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. He is actually elected president. And I think one of the big things he had going for him was the name Napoleon, because the people wanted a strong leader, and Napoleon is remembered as a very strong leader who takes control. And much like his uncle, he names himself emperor in 1852, and he supports industrialization and attempts to modernize France. Moving on to Russia. In the 19th century, Russia was still operating as a feudal system. Remember, this is the government based on land ownership and promises of loyalty and protection. So you had serfs who promised to work the land in return for protection from the nobles. The nobles got the land for promising loyalty to the Russian Tsar. Now, one of the problems that they run into is that the rest of the world is modernizing, and Russia is very slow to catch on to that. Peter the Great had tried to drag them into the modern world, and it did not work very well. So then in the 1850s, you get the Crimean War, which Russia fought in, and the death and destruction of that war shocked all of Europe, but it was especially devastating to the Russians because they lost tons of people to modern weapons, but old tactics. Because the Crimean War was one of the first wars with truly modern weapons, but the armies were still fighting in their traditional manners with lining up and shooting at each other, which once you have rapid fire accurate weapons is just, well, horrible is the only way to describe it. So you have Tsar Alexander II. He frees the serfs in 1861, and he starts reforms because he wants to see Russia modernize and become prosperous. However, he doesn't do enough to make the radicals happy, and they end up assassinating him in 1881 after several failed attempts. So once Alexander II is dead, you have his son, Alexander III, who becomes Tsar, and he ends all reforms. He does support industrialization, but he also enforces Russification. That is, all citizens must adopt the Russian language and culture. Doesn't matter if you are from Georgia or Chechnya or Azerbaijan, Belarus, the Ukraine, any of the Russian republics, it didn't matter. You were going to become Russian. And he used secret police to spy on the people and enforce that rule. So Russia, not a happy place, and we're going to see how that turns out with the Russian Revolution when we get to World War I. All right, that is it for the notes today. Make sure you have copied them all down in your notebook and you show me to get your credit.